On the night of January 8, 1993, winter pressed down hard on the quiet suburb of Palatine, Illinois. Snow lined the streets. Cars moved slowly. The world felt muted, wrapped in cold and routine. Inside a modest fast food restaurant on North-Northwest Highway, the lights of Brown's Chicken and Pasta glowed against the darkness. It was a Friday night, closing time. 7 people were inside. None of them would leave alive. Brown's Chicken wasn't a place people expected violence. It was comfort food. Rotisserie chicken, spaghetti, garlic bread. Families gathered here after basketball games and long work weeks. Teenagers picked up shifts to earn spending money. Managers locked up and went home thinking about nothing more than the drive back through frozen streets. But this night, something had already gone wrong. Inside the restaurant were 7 employees finishing end-of-day routines. The victims were Richard Ehlenfelt, 50, co-owner of the restaurant; Lynn Ehlenfelt, 49, co-owner of the restaurant; Michael Castro, 16, a high school sophomore employee; Guadalupe Maldonado, 46, an employee and father of 3; Thomas Menes, 32, an employee; Marcus Nelson, 31, an employee and U.S. Navy veteran; Rico Salas, 17, a high school student employee. They wiped counters, counted registers, prepped for morning. Nothing about the scene suggested danger. But sometime after 9 p.m., 2 men entered the restaurant. They weren't customers. The men carried guns. They ordered the employees into the walk-in freezer at the back of the restaurant. This was already different from a normal robbery. Robbers usually want cash, fast and clean. They want to get out. But this was controlled, methodical. The cash registers were emptied, but the employees weren't released. Instead, they were marched deeper into the restaurant, to the office area near the freezer. Then the shooting began. 7 gunshots echoed in that confined space. Each victim was shot execution style. Some were shot multiple times. There was no struggle, no escape, no mercy. The killers walked out into the freezing Illinois night, leaving behind one of the most horrifying crime scenes suburban America had ever seen. The next morning, January 9th, the restaurant didn't open. A manager arrived and found the doors unlocked. Inside, the lights were still on. The registers were open. And the floor! The floor told the story before anyone reached the freezer. Police entered and found the bodies stacked together. 7 lives ended in a single, brutal moment. Hardened detectives were shaken. Some stepped outside to breathe. Others stood frozen, staring at the magnitude of what they were seeing. Palatine had never known anything like this. This wasn't just a robbery, it was an execution. And for the families of those 7 victims, time stopped that morning, while the rest of the world moved on. But the killers? They vanished. When detectives stepped inside the Brown's Chicken on the morning of January 9th, 1993, they expected a robbery gone bad. What they found instead was something far worse. 7 bodies lay crumpled together near the walk-in freezer, positioned in a way that told investigators this wasn't chaos. It was control. Each victim had been forced to comply. Each had been executed at close range. The brutality of the scene collided with something else just as disturbing. There were no obvious signs of a struggle. Shell casings were recovered. Ballistics analysis showed 2 different firearms had been used, both handguns. One a .38 caliber, the other a 9 medium. This immediately confirmed what witnesses could not. There were 2 shooters. The victims had been shot from behind or from close proximity, some more than once. This was not panic. This was not fear-driven violence. This was deliberate. And then came the first major problem. No witnesses, no leads. The restaurant was located along a busy road. Cars passed by constantly. Nearby businesses remained open later into the evening. Yet no one reported hearing gunshots. No one saw 2 men running from the scene. No suspicious vehicles were identified. It was as if the killers had dissolved into the cold. Detectives canvassed the area. They knocked on doors. They searched dumpsters, alleys, and snowbanks. Nothing. The killers left behind almost no physical evidence. No fingerprints. No usable footprints in the snow. No dropped weapon. And in 1993, DNA testing was still limited, slow, expensive, and not widely applied to cases like this. Whatever evidence existed would have to wait. News spread fast. Parents pulled their kids from after-school jobs. Business owners locked their doors earlier. Churches filled with people searching for answers that didn't exist. Palatine was a safe town, or at least it believed it was. Now families looked at one another differently. Employees watched customers more closely. Every stranger felt like a potential threat. And hovering over everything was one unbearable question. Why kill everyone? Investigators quickly focused on the idea that someone involved knew the restaurant's closing procedures. The killers knew where the employees would be, when the cash would be counted, how to move them without resistance. That knowledge pointed inward. Police interviewed former employees, current staff at other Brown's Chicken locations, delivery drivers, anyone who knew the layout. One name surfaced again and again: James Dean Degorski. James Degorski was 23 years old in 1993. He had previously worked at the Brown's Chicken in Palatine. He knew the building, he knew the people, and he had a criminal history that included petty theft. Degorski was questioned early on. He denied involvement. There was no physical evidence tying him to the scene. And so, like so many others, he walked out of the police station a free man. Months passed, then years. Tips poured in, then slowed to a trickle. Detectives retired, evidence was boxed and stored, leads dried up. For the families of the victims, grief hardened into something else: anger. They watched anniversaries come and go. They watched the restaurant demolished. They watched the world forget what had happened inside that freezer. Some believed the killers would never be caught. Others feared they were still out there, living normal lives. And tragically, they were right. For nearly a decade, the Brown's Chicken Massacre remained unsolved, a scar on a community and a warning of how completely evil can vanish after doing its work. But the truth has a way of waiting, and in this case, it waited patiently, inside a piece of trash. For 10 years, the evidence from the Brown's Chicken Massacre sat untouched, sealed in boxes, stacked on shelves, waiting for science to catch up to horror. Inside those boxes were fragments of a night that no one could forget, and no one could solve. Then, in the early 2000s, everything changed. Back in 1993, investigators had collected discarded food containers from the restaurant. At the time, it didn't seem important. Robbers eat sometimes. Stress, hunger, routine. It wasn't unusual. But one item stood out years later: a half-eaten piece of fried chicken left behind in the trash. The assumption was simple. The killers had eaten inside the restaurant after murdering 7 people. And in doing so, they had unknowingly left behind something far more valuable than fingerprints. They left behind their DNA. By 2002, DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Cold case units across the country began re-examining old evidence with new eyes and new tools. Palatine detectives reopened the Brown's Chicken file. The chicken bone was sent for testing. The result came back with a full DNA profile. It belonged to a male. And when investigators ran it through databases, they got a hit: James Degorski. Degorski's DNA was already in the system due to a prior burglary arrest. The odds of the DNA belonging to someone else were astronomical. This wasn't a coincidence. This was proof. The man who once walked freely out of the police station was suddenly the center of the case again, this time with science standing behind the accusation. Detectives began surveillance. They followed Degorski quietly, watched his routines, built their case carefully, because this time they couldn't afford to miss. In May 2002, police brought Degorski in for questioning again. At first, he denied everything, but when confronted with the DNA evidence, something shifted. Degorski confessed. He admitted that he and an accomplice, Juan Luna, had robbed the restaurant. He admitted they had forced the employees into the freezer area. And then he said the words investigators had waited nearly a decade to hear. He had pulled the trigger. But he also said something chilling. He claimed the killings were not planned, that they panicked, that it got out of control. The crime scene told a different story. 7 people were executed methodically. 2 guns were used. No one was spared. That doesn't happen by accident. Investigators believed Degorski was minimizing his role, attempting to soften the narrative of what had been done. But there was no softening this. 7 families had waited 10 years for a name. Now they had 2. Juan Luna. Juan Luna was a former Brown's Chicken employee. He knew the layout. He knew the procedures. He knew who would be inside that night. Police arrested Luna shortly after Degorski's confession. Unlike Degorski, Luna did not confess. He maintained his innocence, but the evidence was mounting. Witnesses placed the men together, the DNA tied Degorski to the scene, and their past connection to the restaurant painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. When the arrests were announced, Palatine reacted with a mix of relief and rage. Relief that the killers were finally identified. Rage that they had walked free for 10 years, living ordinary lives, while families buried children, siblings, friends. Vigils were held. Names were spoken again. For the first time in a decade, justice felt possible. But it wasn't finished. Not yet. Because confession is not conviction. And in a case this old, this brutal, every word would be dissected, every doubt magnified. The courtroom would become the next battlefield. Nearly 10 years after the Brown's Chicken Massacre, justice finally entered the room. But the courtroom wasn't just a place for verdicts. It was a place where grief was reopened, dissected, and placed under a microscope. For the families of the 7 victims, the trials were not an ending. They were a reckoning. The state's case. Prosecutors laid out a chilling narrative. They described 2 men, James Degorski and Juan Luna, who entered the restaurant with guns, forced employees into the back, and executed them one by one. This was not chaos. This was control. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the DNA evidence, the half-eaten chicken bone that placed Degorski inside the restaurant after the murders. They also presented Degorski's confession, testimony about both men's familiarity with the restaurant, evidence showing 2 firearms were used. The message was clear. These men knew exactly what they were doing. Degorski's defense team tried to dismantle the confession. They argued the statement was coerced. He was confused. He exaggerated his role. The killings were unplanned, but the DNA didn't lie. The jury didn't have to rely on memory or emotion. It had science, and science was unforgiving. In 2009, after deliberation, the jury returned a verdict. Guilty. James Degorski was convicted of 7 counts of first-degree murder. The courtroom erupted in emotion. Some family members wept. Others stared at Degorski, searching for something that wasn't there. He showed little reaction, no apology, no visible remorse. Degorski was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge called the murders cold, calculated, and utterly senseless. For the first time since 1993, one of the men responsible would never again walk free. But the story was only halfway finished. On May 10, 2007, Juan Luna was found guilty of all 7 counts of murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole on May 17th. The state sought the death penalty, which was available at the time, but the jury's vote of 11-1 in favor of the death penalty fell short of the required unanimity to impose it. The Brown's chicken case did not conclude with clean lines or complete closure. 7 victims remained gone forever. For the families, justice felt partial, incomplete. Because when 7 people are murdered, accountability should be just as absolute. Did justice truly win? True crime often remembers killers by name. But this story is not about them. This story is about 7 people who went to work on a cold Friday night and never came home. Their lives were not defined by how they died, but by who they were before that moment. Tonight we say their names. Richard Ehlenfelt, 50, co-owner of the restaurant. Lynn Ehlenfelt, 49, co-owner of the restaurant. Michael Castro, 16, a high school sophomore employee. Guadalupe Maldonado, 46, an employee and father of 3. Thomas Menes, 32, an employee. Marcus Nelson, 31, an employee and U.S. Navy veteran. Rico Solis, 17, a high school student employee. For the families, grief didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, then stayed forever. Holidays became unbearable. Empty chairs became permanent. Parents buried children. Siblings grew older without them. And every year, January 8th reopened the wound. A plaque now marks the site where Brown's Chicken once stood. It doesn't tell the whole story. It can't, because the truth is simple and devastating. 7 lives were taken for nothing. No amount of money, no reason, no justification. Just human wreckage left behind by greed and violence. The victims deserve to be remembered not as part of a crime scene, but as people whose absence is still felt. And as we reach the end of this story, we're left with what remains. If DNA testing had been available sooner, Degorski may not have lived freely for 10 years. 10 years of normalcy. 10 years while families grieved. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is justice diminished. And for some families, that delay will always sting. The Brown's Chicken massacre still echoes in Palatine. Employees across the country lock doors more carefully. Closing shifts carry quiet tension. And the idea that it can't happen here no longer feels certain. Because it did happen here. And it can happen anywhere. This case is not just about murder. It's about memory. It's about the responsibility we carry to remember victims and to never stop asking for answers. Because sometimes justice arrives late. But when it does, it carries the weight of every year it was missing. There are crimes that feel distant, removed by time, geography, or disbelief. And then there are crimes like this one. The Brown's Chicken massacre didn't happen in the shadows. It didn't happen in isolation. It happened in a brightly lit restaurant on a familiar road in a town that believed it was safe. That's what makes it unbearable. 7 people showed up for work. They followed rules. They trusted routine. They believed they would go home. Instead, they were forced into a space meant to preserve food and became frozen in time themselves, remembered forever in a moment they didn't choose. And 7 families were left holding a grief that no verdict could lift. This case reminds us that the law measures guilt, but memory measures loss, and loss has no statute of limitations. For years, the killers lived ordinary lives. They ate meals. They celebrated holidays. They blended into crowds. Meanwhile, parents visited graves. Siblings grew up without laughter they should have known. Chairs stayed empty. That imbalance is the quiet cruelty of unsolved violence. But there is something else here too. A reminder that truth leaves traces. That even in the most controlled violence, something human is left behind, something that refuses to disappear. In this case, it was a fragment of DNA. In others, it may be a witness, a memory, a name someone refuses to forget. The Brown's Chicken Massacre is not just a story about murder. It is a story about patience, about science, about the long arc of accountability, and most of all, it is a story about 7 people whose lives mattered. Remember them. This has been Human Wreckage. I'm Thomas, and this is what remains.